Going to take a look at some basic Maya input functions. So what you can see here, first of all, here's our screen. This is our ground plane where we're going to be making our models. And Maya, of course, starts out as a fairly comprehensive interface, lots of things on here. So just want to focus on getting some of the key things down, and then we can take a look at some of the other aspects. If your screen doesn't look exactly like mine, then there are a few things probably that is set when it starts out, but you should be able to recognize most of these things. So here's my ground plane right here. And the ground plane, right now you're looking at it in perspective view. So perspective means that it's coming at an angle. Think of this as a flat surface. Things far off in the distance are smaller, just like typical perspective. And if we go over here, here is our perspective view right here. You can also split your screen up into 4 panels. So now you've got 4 views of the same object. So think of it like 4 cameras looking at your object. This is looking down from a top view. Here is the front view, and here's the side view, and here is our perspective view. We could also split it into 2 panels, a front and a perspective. Usually for most purposes, the perspective is the best. And of course, you can switch into any particular one and focus on that. We'll get back to that a little bit later. Now, the key thing to remember too is not just that we are in perspective, but this is a Cartesian coordinate system. So each of these grid squares represents 1 unit of space. And there's no particular millimeters or inches involved in here. It's just units. Although thinking of them as millimeters, it wouldn't hurt. Now, if you take a look down here at this little bug in the lower left-hand corner, these are our axes. You can see that the directions correspond with the letters. So the x-axis is running along in this direction. The z-axis is running along in this direction. And the y-axis, if you could draw a vertical line straight up, that would be the y-axis, running vertically up and down below our grid. This is 0, 0. And if you think of this sort of as a quadrant system, then the coordinates will get positive and negative just depending on where you are relative to 0. We don't tend to focus too much on the coordinates when we're doing polygonal modeling, but it's just sort of useful to know that that's there. Okay, I'm just going to drop an object in here. I'm just going to put a cylinder right in the middle just for reference so you can see what happens when I start using the mouse functions. So here is my cylinder. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my mouse to move around the screen. I want to change the view of my screen. You can already see that I zoomed in a bit on my object. And I'm doing that with the middle mouse button. The middle scroll wheel button will allow you to zoom in and out on your object. Okay, so that's a useful one to know. Now, the other ways we can move around is by using the mouse button, but the key thing to remember is this. Oh, by the way, one quick little note here. This means that my object has been selected. This is my current object that I am working on. It's got this little grid, looks like something out of Tron, little green and blue grid around it. I'll talk about these lines a little bit later. And this is my selection tool. So my selection tool is currently activated, looks like a mouse cursor, and I grab that by pressing the Q key. You can see the keys that I'm pressing are going to show up down here in the corner. So the Q key activates my selection tool. All right. Now, in order to move in and out, like I said, we've got our middle mouse button. Now, another way of selecting is I've got my selection tool down. Now I can either click on it or I can use my mouse to select them. So this will allow me to select everything that is in that window. So this is just basically pressing the left mouse button and dragging. and that is a selection window. Now, the thing is though, I would like to be able to move around. So what we want to do there is to press the Alt key. So to pressing the Alt key and holding it down, now when I use my left mouse button, now I can tumble my object around in my perspective viewport, and I can see whichever view of it I want to see. So holding down the Alt button and the left mouse button, that will allow me to tumble it. If I hold the Alt mouse button or the Alt button down on the keyboard and press the middle mouse button, that is a pan. And the Alt button and the right mouse button does a zoom as well. So if you move your mouse, you will zoom in and out on your object. Okay, so that's very important to remember, that is that by itself, clicking your mouse will select objects. Drag a window around it will also select object. The right mouse button has a completely different function, and we'll talk about that in a bit. All right, holding the Alt key down, that allows you to move your object around. Okay, so remember the Alt key is very important. So once we have our object, here are a few more little keys that we want to work with. So the other keys we want to work with are how to manipulate the object, how to move it, scale it, and rotate it. And those three keys are the W key, the E key, and the R key. Now, those only will, notice how when I press those keys, they highlight these little icons over here. And those are my tools that allow me to manipulate my object. First thing I have to do though before I can manipulate an object is I have to select my object. So I'm going to press Q for my selection tool, and that lets me select my object. Now, once I've got my object selected, now I'm going to work on it. So the first thing I'm going to do is press the W key. Now, as soon as I press the W key, I'm going to rotate this around so you can actually see. As soon as I press the W key, this little icon shows up. This little icon is my move icon. And you'll notice that it's got three different colored arrows, a blue one, a red one, and a green one. And those correspond to my axes. Green is Y, red is X, blue is Z. So if I select an arrow now, I can move my object along those axes, whichever axis it corresponds to. And it'll only move along the axis that that corresponds to. Now, if I select one of the squares, you notice here's the green arrow. Here is a corresponding green square. What that's going to do is it's going to move it in the plane that that axis is normal to. That is, imagine that this green line is at a right angle or perpendicular to this green plane. This is my XZ plane. And this would be my YZ plane, so I can move it around in my YZ plane. And of course, this is my XY plane, moving it around in my XY plane. And if you grab in the center here, you can move it around in 3 space, although I don't really recommend that. It's a little bit hard to see where you're moving it to. So that is the Move tool. Now, the next tool I get by pressing E. E is the Rotate tool. So again, you can see the color-coded lines. So red is a circle that is on a plane where the x-axis is perpendicular to that. So this means rotate about the x-axis. So rotate with the x-axis as your sort of center axis. And this, of course, rotate about the z-axis. Now, and then rotate about the y-axis. Now notice I am not rotating about what's called the world y-axis. When you start rotating your object around, what happens is these axes will always stay aligned with the object's axes. So the object axis, sort of imagine that this is the top point. Imagine a line going down to the center point, and that would be the object's y-axis. But I've rotated my object slightly. So you can see it's rotating about that axis. It's not rotating it around in a big circle. Now you can change all of that and change how you can rotate it or what you want to rotate it about, but it's just useful to be aware of that. Let's start with another cylinder here just to reset it. The last key is the R key, and what the R key does is it scales. You can scale in a specific axis. So this scales along the y-axis. This one will scale along the z-axis, along the x-axis, and of course scale in 2 dimensions. Or you can also use the center mouse button to scale in 3 dimensions. Okay, so those are the introductory keys that we want. What I suggest you do now is add a few more shapes onto here. Notice how when you add a shape, it will always appear at the origin, centered at the origin. Try adding a few more shapes. Try rotating them, moving them, looking at them from the top views, tumbling. Use your mouse key to tumble around. Okay, that will kind of help you out, get you used to using the program.